So my research is particularly focused on understanding how children develop when they're really young, so 3 and 4 year old children in particular. But today I'm going to be talking a little bit about personality and the psychology of personality. So first off, I just was wondering if any of you are planning on studying psychology at A level. If you're thinking about studying psychology at A level, you could either react if you've got a way of reacting, raise your hand or put something in the chat just to let us know. So I think it's quite a popular one these days, but I think it's one of those subjects that people maybe don't know as much about because it's not always something that you can do when you're earlier on in school or when you're doing your GCSEs. So great, I can see loads of you responding saying you're thinking about studying psychology at A level. And you probably aren't really sure what you'd want to study at university yet, if that's something you're thinking of going on to do. But I can tell you a little bit about what it's like to study psychology at university. So it's normally a 3 or 4 year degree, and you might be able to do a little bit. A lot of courses these days have the option to do a year in the middle where you can get a bit of experience working in a research group or in some sort of get some kind of hands-on experience. You'll normally do a mixture of different modules to do with kind of developmental psychology, so how children develop. You might do some kind of social psychology, understanding the relationships between people, biological psychology, so understanding kind of how the brain works, and various other areas. But you might also have the option of studying lots of different interesting modules. So if you're thinking about studying psychology at university, it's a really good idea to try and get an understanding of what is on offer at different universities. I know some universities offer, for example, the psychology of music, forensic psychology, so kind of understanding kind of how people respond in a courtroom situation, for example. You might do something like the psychology of language learning. There'll be lots of different options that you might be more or less interested in. And there's a lot that you can go on to do with psychology. I think a lot of us think of psychology as going on to be a clinical psychologist or a therapist, but there's a lot more that you can do with a psychology degree. So for me, I've gone into kind of research, but you could also go into kind of education type fields. Some people go on to do more kind of business related jobs. If you do want to go on and do clinical psychology, there's a lot more studying involved. You can't just go on to be a clinical psychologist with a psychology degree. Unfortunately, you'd have to keep going at it for a bit longer. There's a lot of different subjects you can go on to do with psychology. And I think something that people don't realize is that there's actually quite a lot of maths in psychology. We have to do statistics because we need to understand the research and we need to understand whether we need to have some kind of data to explain what we know about how people kind of behave. So there is a little bit of maths that you might not expect with psychology. It's not all kind of just learning about people's behaviors. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about personality. So that's something that you would probably touch on if you do A-level psychology, and you would definitely touch on it in a psychology degree as well. So we'll just think a little bit to start with about what personality is. So personality is, I don't know if my slides are changing. Sorry, it's loading for me. Okay, perfect. So personality, this is a definition that I got from the American Psychological Association. So when we talk about personality, we're talking about enduring characteristics. That means characteristics that last throughout your life. It's not kind of an in the moment characteristic, and the behavior that comes with it that are kind of unique to a specific person. And we might talk about things like traits. So kind of by a trait, we're talking about kind of those adjectives that we might use. So kind of I'm a kind person, or I'm a lazy person, or that's what we're talking about with traits, but also kind of talking about the interests, the things that drive people, the values, self-concept, abilities, and emotional patterns. So there's a lot going on in here. Today, I'm really going to focus more on traits because they're the easiest thing to measure. And we'll be talking a little bit about some of the key questions in psychology, in personality research. So when we as psychologists are looking at the question of personality, there are a lot of questions that come to mind. So first off, we need to think about how we can measure personality. It's something that we're all quite aware of when we meet other people, but it might not be something that we can put into numbers or measure very easily because everybody's got such a unique personality. We also want to think about kind of why we have the personality that we have. Is it genetic? Is it affected by the world around us? Is it affected by our experiences when we're very young? We also might want to think about how personality affects the way we behave, the choices we might make in life. We've also got this question of whether personality might change across the lifespan. So as we get older, does our personality change? Are we always the same? Do we always have the same personality? And there's also some limitations to personality research. So we might talk a little bit about those later. So I'm going to talk about, so there are some different approaches to measuring personality, but I'm really going to be talk about something that we call trait-based theories of personality. So that's traits. When we talk about traits, we're talking about kind of adjectives, words that we might use to describe our personality. And the most popular theory of personality is this idea that we can describe everyone's personality using these 5 personality traits. And for each of us, we fall somewhere on a continuum on each of these traits. So just to kind of illustrate that here, I've got some more adjectives here. So we've got here neuroticism. So this might also be referred to as kind of emotional stability at the other end of the scale. So people who are very neurotic might be very emotional people. They might be prone to some traits, like maybe they might be anxious, they might be prone to depression, and people on the other end of the scale might be as we can see here, fearless or shameless. We've got extroversions. That might be one that you're a bit more familiar with. So on one end of the scale, we've got people who just, really recharge by spending their time with people who enjoy spending time with other people, maybe seek out attention from other people. And at the other end of the scale, we get people who really recharge by spending time by themselves. They might be withdrawn from other people. Then we've got openness. So here we're talking about openness to experience. So we're talking about things like how open you are to new experiences. Are you open to doing new things, to meeting new people, to going to new places? We might also include kind of some creative thinking here. And people who aren't very open to new experiences, we might describe as kind of being inflexible or closed-minded. They're people who prefer, comforting things around them, the things that they already know. Then we've got agreeableness. So that might be a bit similar to, so this is kind of how much we are willing to mold ourselves to other people. So how kind of agreeable we are towards other people. So on one end of the scale, we might have people who are quite selfless. They might do things for other people, but they might also be gullible. They might also follow other people's instructions when that's not the best in their best interests. And at the other end of the scale, we might have people who we might describe as selfish or who put themselves first. We've got some other adjectives here. And finally, we've got conscientiousness. So this is similar to kind of being hardworking. So at the high end of the scale, we might have people who are very hardworking, maybe perfectionist, but also on the more negative end of that high end of the scale, you might have people who are more kind of workaholics. And at the lower end of the scale, you might have people who are less hardworking, who might kind of put less time into their work, might make irresponsible decisions sometimes. So these are these kind of big 5 personality traits, and a lot of research based in personality is based around these kind of these 5 traits. And because this is a way that we can kind of define everybody's personalities and describe everybody's personalities in a way that we can kind of compare them against each other. You might see other ways of measuring personality. Some of them are more often used for kind of job interviews and things like that, or there are various other ways of describing personality, but this one is very commonly used in the research, and it's been really, really well used. So we can see that you can kind of describe these 5 personality traits in various different cultures across the world, in people of different ages, and that these kind of traits stick together across different types of people. We might think that there might be something missing here as well. So this is kind of coming back to those issues in personality, in describing personality. So I don't know if there's anything, if anyone's got any ideas looking at that. Do you think there's anything that you would include as part of your personality that might be missing here that you can't see as part of these traits? You can pop it in the chat if you can think of any. A common one that we hear about is humor. We don't have humor included here, and a lot of people really define themselves as being a funny person or less or not such a funny person, a serious person, and that might not be something that's included here. So coming back to those kind of key questions, so how do we measure this? So we tend to measure these big 5 traits of personalities using questionnaires. So in that the task that I gave you to complete before the talk, before this session, I think you had the chance to do a personality, to have a little look at a personality quiz. So we offer that's how researchers look at personality as well. So we get people to talk about their own personality. You might also have a personality questionnaire where you might ask somebody else to report on your personality. So for example, if you were trying to find out about the personality of a very young child, they probably can't talk about their own personality. So you might get their parents to report on their personality. But you might also, there are some studies that use both self-reports and reports by other people. And that's quite interesting because you might not view yourself in the same way as the way that other people view you. And other ways that you might look at personality, you might look at, psychologists might do observations. They might see how people respond to specific situations. Again, you might do that if you were working with very young children to kind of see how they act in a play-based situation. We also have, you might come across situational judgment tests. So these are tests where they give you a specific situation and you say how you would react in that situation. You might often see that for kind of job interviews, that kind of occupational psychology, understanding if somebody's a good match for a specific job. And sometimes you might also have a professional, so maybe a clinical psychologist who might interview somebody to try and establish what their personality is. This might be more common if somebody has got as in a forensic psychology situation in which, where somebody has committed a crime, or in a situation where somebody has got an abnormal personality, so they might have a personality disorder, then maybe a professional would be the person who would kind of diagnose that. But most of the time in psychological research, we get people to report on their own personality. So if you just want to think about that, do you think that you'd be good at reporting on your own personality? Do you think you know yourself well? Or maybe other people might know you better than you know yourself? I've got just an interesting graph here. If there was a study where they asked parents and siblings of young people to report on what the personality is of the participants. They got people to report on their own personality. They got their siblings to report on their personality and their parents. And just across all the people who took part in the study here, you can see what I think is quite interesting here in this graph is, and maybe isn't very surprising for those of you who have siblings, you can see that siblings rated their sibling as being less agreeable. So this is agreeableness we're looking at here, less agreeable than you rate yourself or than your parents rate you. That might not be very surprising for those of us who have siblings. The siblings might get a different experience of your personality. So it's all very good kind of reporting on this personality, testing personality using these questionnaires, but why is personality important? So we might think about the role that personality has to play in the way that we behave, the way that we interact with the world, the way that we interact with other people. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of ways in which personality might affect the way that we behave. So there are lots more examples of this. If you look at nearly anything, there'll be an example of how your personality might affect the way you behave. But one example here, this study, the first study I'm looking at here, was looking at whether people were likely to move house over a 5-year period. This was all in the UK, and how far away they were likely to move. And they found that people who were more extroverted were more likely to move house at least once during the 5-year period than people who were introverted. And that people who were more open to experiences, so who scored high on the openness to experiences, were more likely to make long distance moves, so to move further away. And people who were less open to experiences are more likely to make short distance moves. What does et al mean? That's a good question. So et al just means so this reference here, so Shuttleworth is just the surname of one of the people who did the study. Et al just means that there were a lot more people who were involved in the study. And that's just a way of, I don't want to write out all the names, so I'm just writing et al. You'll see it a lot. If you go on to study psychology, you'll see et al all over the place. It's just a way of referencing people, but good question. And yeah, people who are less open to experiences are more likely to make short distance moves. This might not be super surprising to you. It doesn't always have to. Somebody's said it's meant to be in italics. Yes, maybe sometimes, depending on the referencing that you're using, the referencing style you're using. And another study that was looking at looking at personality traits and how likely people are to have children and how many children they're likely to have. So in one study here, this 2011 study, they found that people who were more extroverted, more open to experiences, and less neurotic were more likely to go on to have more children. So we do find that kind of the way we rate our personality might be related to the way we behave as well. So something that might be very relevant to all of you, I know you'll all be doing your GCSEs next year. So just thinking about these personality traits, which of these personality traits do you think might be most likely to be related to academic attainment? So how well you do at school. So we'll look at some data there. So if anybody's got any ideas about which of these personality traits might be related to how well you do at school, just pop those in the chat. So just as a reminder here, conscientiousness is how hardworking you are. Extroversion is how much you want to spend your time with other people. Neuroticism is how emotional you are, and openness to experiences, how open you are to new experiences. So got a few people in the chat there saying conscientiousness is the one that they would expect to be the most related to academic achievement, and you are 100% correct. We've got somebody who's guessed agreeableness. That's also a good guess there. But when we look at what the strongest predictor of the strongest personality related predictor of academic success is conscientiousness. And what's quite interesting here, so in this study, they looked at cognitive ability, personality, and academic performance in more than 400,000 participants across the world. And they found that conscientiousness was the strongest predictor of performance, even when you take cognitive ability into account. So I think that's something that's maybe a lesson for all of you who are doing your GCSEs next year, or maybe some even this year, that being hardworking is important, even when you take into account how kind of much cognitive ability you have to start with. So conscientiousness is really important there. Haven't got this on the slide here, but there was from the same study, they spoke about how openness to experience was quite important for children's academic success earlier on in school, but less important later on in school. But I think you're right. I think I saw somebody saying that maybe all of them will play a part, and I've just spoken about the most important here. But I think if you look at the study in more detail, there are different. Some of the other measures might have a bit of a role to play there as well. So we've spoken a little bit about why personality might be important, how we measure personality, and how it might affect our behavior. So now let's talk a little bit about why we have differences in personality. Why do we differ so much? Because if you think about the people around you, everybody's got a different personality, and there are various different factors that might affect that. So if you're thinking about your own personality, and you can pop this in the chat if you'd like to, do you think that your genetics, so kind of the genetic material you get from your parents, is more important? Do you think it's the environment that you grow up in? Do you think maybe it's the school environment, the people that are around you? Or do you think it's maybe half, a bit of both? So we've got a few people here saying environment, both. We haven't had many people say genetics. So yeah, we've got a few saying both. Definitely. So we'll have a little look at that. So you might have looked a little bit, I don't know if you've done anything to do with heritability in biology. It might be something that you're doing a bit later. So when we look at heritability, we're looking at this idea of nature versus nurture. How much of your personality is caused by genetics and how much of it is caused by the environment that you live in? So when we talk about genetics, we're just talking about that genetic material that you get from your parents, and it's all there from the moment you're conceived. But when we're talking about the environment, we're talking about everything else. So what happens when your mom is pregnant with you, what happens when you're a young child, what happens at school, the people around you. And if a trait, sorry, well, I'm just looking at the messages. So we've got some interesting ideas here. So genetics only affect physical appearance. That's an interesting idea there. So we've got some kind of debates in the chat there. That's okay. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of what the research says about whether personality is due to your genes or just due to the environment. So we've got a few people asking how genetics might affect personality, and we can talk a little bit about that. So if we think about heritability, we know that, say, eye color is not always 100%, but almost 100% heritable. So your eye color comes from the genes that you receive from your parents. Height, for example, is about 80% heritable. It's mostly related to the genes that you receive from your parents. However, it might vary a bit depending on your diet, depending on the experiences that you have growing up, how much exercise you do, the type of environment that you grow up in. And I've got another example there of something that's 0% heritable. The language that you speak is 0% heritable. You could take a baby who is born to French-speaking parents, and you could put them in an English-speaking family, and that baby would speak English. There's no way that baby would speak French. So those are just some examples of different traits we have here. So we had some guesses about whether how heritable we might think that personality is. And we've had I had somebody in the chat who was talking about monozygotic twins having similar characteristics. That's exactly what we're coming on to here. So there are a few ways that we might try to measure heritability. So for example, we've got so when we tend to look at when we're looking at heritability, a really common way of looking at heritability is looking at twins. So we've got nature has given us a really perfect way of looking at the influence of genetics. We've got identical twins or monozygotic twins who have 100% of the same genetics, and if they grow up together, they will have shared environmental influences, but although their environment will not be 100% the same because they'll have different experiences growing up. Then we've got fraternal twins or dizygotic twins who have 50% of the same genetics and will have some shared environment as well. And this is and what we find is when we look at kind of when we look at sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat. So what we find when we look at kind of personality traits is how we can look at personality traits and understand how how heritable a trait is we can compare how often identical twins have the trait in common compared to fraternal twins. So I've got a little graph here looking at some of these different traits. So what you can see is, so overall, most of the traits come to about kind of, so the traits range in heritability here, but you can see that for all of these personality traits that we have here, monozygotic, so identical twins, are more similar than dizygotic twins. So what we can see there is, because there's that difference there, monozygotic twins are more likely to be similar than dizygotic twins. That means that there is some level of heritability there. That means that if you share exactly the same genes, you are more likely to have those traits in common. And you can see that it varies a little bit according to different personality traits. So we can see, so dizygotic, so I've got the question here. So dizygotic are fraternal twins, non-identical twins. Monozygotic are identical twins. So it just means monozygotic means that they come from one egg, and dizygotic means they come from two eggs. And so you can see that the traits do vary a little bit. So there is potentially more of a genetic component to openness and extroversion, less of a genetic component to conscientiousness, agreeableness, and maybe neuroticism. So we might think that there is more of an environmental factor there. But we've got an issue here. So what we can see here, in most cases, identical twins grow up together. So we can't really separate out the environment from the genetics here. So in both cases, we've got the genetics, they share the same environment, and they will share some of their genetics as well. Has anyone got any ideas about any other ways that we could try to separate out genetics from the environment? If anyone's maybe done any reading or any other any ideas about different ways that we could look, and if you have any other ideas, you can pop it in the chat and I'll have a look. But so another way that we can look at the heritability of traits is looking at where are we here? Adoption. So adoption is another example of something that so we've got an example here. So we could, oh, sorry, I'm still in the meeting, but I've made it disappear. Just a moment. Somebody here has said we could separate twins at birth and give them to families in different countries. And that would be a fantastic experiment. But unfortunately, ethically, we can't really do that. We can't separate twins. There have been some examples in the past of people separating identical twins and sending them to different countries or with different people to sending them to live with different families. But ethically, it's not really something we can do. But something that happens anyway is adoption. So we can look at how much the adopted child, how much of a child's personality is in common with their adopted family versus their biological family. And what's really interesting here is that we find something that seems quite counterintuitive, which is that if you look at the personality correlations between adopted children and their biological families, there are very small personality correlations. There's not a lot in common there. But there are other studies that suggest that there are also very few personality correlations between adopted children and their adoptee family members. So this seems almost like these adopted children are different from, they're not like their biological families, and they're also not like their adopted families. So what we can think here is that maybe we've got an interplay between the two. So somebody might have the potential to have certain personality traits. So you might have a child who has the potential to be very extroverted, and then you put them with an introverted family, and they might be less extroverted than they would be, but still not as introverted as the family that they spend their time with. So we can think of this as kind of the capacity. You might have a genetic capacity for certain traits, but depending on the environment that you spend your time in, you might see those traits emerge in different ways. So, for example, you might have the genetic capacity to be very, very agreeable. You might have to trust people, to be very selfless. But if you find yourself in an environment where people aren't very trustworthy, you might be less less agreeable than you would have been in a family where you think the world is very trustworthy. So we can think of ourselves as all having this maybe kind of capacity for different personality traits, but depending on the environment you find yourself in, you might see it emerge in different ways. So I'll just look at, I've had a couple of questions in the chat. How does having separate parents have an impact on the development of twins as they grow up? So you would have so separated parents there. I think you'd have different influences in the same way that everybody has different influences in their home from their two parents. So that would have an impact on the environment that you find yourself growing up in. But it would really vary depending on how similar the families are, and in the same way that in any home you'll have different influences going on there. So this is just a very brief kind of touch on kind of how heritable personality is, this nature versus nurture debate. It's a really interesting debate, and it's something that we can kind of talk about. There's a lot of research looking at how heritable, for example, intelligence is, how heritable various different traits are. And I think the task that I've given you to carry on with to kind of extend this learning a bit more is looking a little bit more at that nature versus nurture debate, which you might have also touched on in biology. I'm not sure if you will have done it yet. So now I'm going to move on a little bit to looking at how our personalities change over the our lifespan. So that might seem like an odd thing to say after this first slide here, where we spoke about personality being enduring, so something that's quite stable over the lifespan. And that was how personality was seen for a really long time. It was seen as something that's stable, something that doesn't change very much over the lifespan. But the more research that has gone into it, the more understanding we have that really our personalities do change a little bit over our lifespan, but they might change. We probably won't. Somebody who's very introverted probably won't become very extroverted later on in life, but we do change in some ways over our lifespan. So we've got a couple of different ways of looking at how personality changes over the lifespan. One of the things that we could do is we could test, we could do what we call longitudinal research. So that means that we test the same person multiple times, or the same people multiple times at different ages. So we might take a child and test them when they are 5 years old, then 10 years old, then 15 years old, etc., etc. And this is a really great way of carrying out research and of controlling for other factors, because we know that this is the same person. So we know we don't have, we know that any changes are changes in that person. They're not changes because they were born in different decades or something along those lines. But another way that we can often look at kind of how personality changes across the lifespan is what we call cross-sectional research. And that means testing people across different ages. So we might take a group of 25-year-olds and compare them to a group of 35-year-olds and compare them to a group of 45-year-olds, for example, and then take the differences between those groups as a way of kind of describing the differences in the population as a whole as they age. But there's a key issue there. We need to make sure that if we're doing this cross-sectional research, we have to make sure that these groups aren't different in some way. So if we took 25-year-olds who were all very extroverted and compared them to 35-year-olds who were all very introverted, we might assume that you become a lot more introverted between the age of 25 and 35. So we need to make sure that we're balancing those things and not, and that isn't the reason why we're finding differences there, isn't because of differences in the group as a whole. And we also might find that some of the differences that we find might also not be to do with the age. It might be to do with the experience of life that people have depending on when they were born. So, for example, when I didn't have a mobile phone, and I got a smartphone when I was 15, and that was when kind of people started. So I didn't, the first 15 years of my life, I didn't have a touch screen, I didn't have a smartphone. Whereas for your generation, you've had smartphones since you were very young. maybe you don't have them yourself, but you've had access to smartphones since you were very young. And that kind of difference in generations, difference in the experience that children have, might be something that that might affect some of our findings. But it might not be to do with age. It might be to do with the kind of environment that people are growing up in. So one thing that we can do. So one way of looking at so we can either do this kind of longitudinal research, cross-sectional research, or we can kind of combine the two. So we could take a group of 25-year-olds and test them all 5 years later and 10 years later, and then a group of 35-year-olds and test them all 5 years later and 10 years later. This is quite a good solution, but it's very expensive. It takes a lot of time. You won't have your findings very quickly. So often people do end up going for the cross-sectional approach. This graph is very blurry. I don't know why it's so blurry on my screen. Is it? I think it's probably blurry on your screens as well. I'll just see if I can. Okay. So I'll just talk about what we've got on that graph. So thinking back to those big 5 personality traits that we spoke about. Oh, is it not blurry for you guys? Maybe it's just blurry for me. Okay, we'll go back to that graph in that screen in a moment, but I want you to make some predictions before we go onto that screen. So thinking back to those big 5 personality traits, we'll go back to this slide here so we can look at them. Do you have any predictions about how these traits might change over adulthood? So between being a young adult, a middle-aged person, an older adult, has anyone got any predictions about how any of these traits might change? Do you think you might become, for instance, more extroverted as you get older, less open to experiences? I'll see if we've got any. So if you have any predictions there, then just let me know and we'll have a little look at the graphs. So we've got a prediction here that we might become less open to experiences as we get older. So we've got a prediction here that children might be more fearless. So children might be, might be less neurotic, I guess, more open to experiences. Older people might be less agreeable and less open to experiences. There's another prediction here. Conscientiousness increases. We've got another guess there. So we've got some interesting ones there. Do you think that maybe we keep getting more and more conscientious, more hardworking as we get older, or does it kind of change across the lifespan? So we'll have a little look at the graphs that I've got here. So if they're not blurry for you, that's fantastic, because they are blurry for me and I don't know why. So what we've got here are some graphs looking at these different personality traits. So emotional stability is just another way of referring to neuroticism. You'll see it referred to both in different papers and different research. So what we can see here is this is just across adulthood, so from age 20 up to 80, I believe. Again, it's really blurry, so I can't see it on my screen. So whoever predicted that you become less open to experiences, if we look at graph C here, you can see that prediction was correct. Across a large population as a whole, and I believe this research was carried out in the US, so it might be different across different cultures. But you can see that people tend to become less open to experiences as they get older. Conscientiousness, I think we had a prediction about becoming more conscientious. We can see here in graph E that people become more conscientious as they start to get to working age. That might not be a large surprise. And that conscientiousness slightly drops off as we get older, but it kind of just kind of fizzles out. It's kind of flat towards the end there. So we have that question. Emotional stability is the same as neuroticism. Yeah, it's sometimes you'll see it referred to as one, sometimes the other. It's the same thing. And what else have we got there? So we had a prediction that people might become less agreeable as they get older, but actually what we're seeing on this graph here is that around the time people hit retirement age, they might become more agreeable. Maybe that's because they've got more time for themselves and less responsibilities. And emotional stability and extroversion, we don't see huge changes across the lifespan here. We also see some changes in personality related to specific life events as well. So we kind of saw this on the graph there. So we tend to see that conscientiousness tends to increase until middle age and then decrease after retirement probably because people have more time and don't have to be as conscientious. Then we've got this other one here. So there's research showing that your first romantic relationship may be linked to increases in emotional stability, so a decrease in neuroticism, that would mean, and increases in extroversion. Just remember again that this is over a really big population of people. It would be different for different people here. The transition from school to college or work is associated with increases in agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, and decreases in neuroticism. So that might not be super surprising as well, as that's kind of when you're coming out of those kind of teenage years, when I'm sure you're all very conscientious, agreeable, and open, but you might get even more conscientious, agreeable, and open as you get a bit older. And there are other life events which might affect your personality. For example, if you experience trauma, if you have a child. Another example is people who are older people who experience dementia. You might experience personality changes in relation to kind of changes in your brain as well. It's really common, in fact, to have personality changes in relation to dementia. But these changes might be a little bit more complex. We might see different changes in different people. And then we've also got, just as an example here, just talking about adolescence and young adulthood, as this might be the most relevant period for you guys. We can see that there are, this is a study, I think this was in Germany, they did this study. And this was looking at looking at the different personality traits and how they change between the age of 12, 17 and 29 here. So across kind of adolescence and going into adulthood. And you can see that we've got increases in conscientiousness, which might not be super surprising when you think about the differences in life and responsibilities that you might have between the age of 17 and 29. But what else have we got here? So between the age of 12 and 17, people, so this is by their parents' rating, actually. We've got self-rating and parent rating here. So parents rate their children as being becoming less neurotic between the age of 12 and 17, but people don't rate themselves as becoming less neurotic. So it might be to do with the relationship the parents have with the child. And what else have we got here? So openness, we can see that people rate themselves. So parents rate their child as becoming more open as they become an adult, but it's relatively stable how we rate ourselves, which I think is quite interesting here, looking at these slight differences between how we might rate ourselves and how other people might rate us. It kind of emphasizes how it's important to take more sources of data into account, because who's to say really who has a better idea of what your personality is? Is it you? Is it your parents? Is it your friends? Everyone will have a slightly different experience there. And that's actually one of those big issues in personality research, is the personality might be very different across different contexts, across the different environments you might find yourself in. And really, what is there any way of really defining what personality is? Because there are various reasons why we might rate ourselves as higher in certain situations, or like, for example, you might rate yourself as being a very extroverted person in contexts where you're with a group of friends who you're very comfortable with, or at school where you're around people that you know. But you might find yourself being very introverted if you're at an event full of loads of adults that you don't know, and kind of finding what you're so that there's a lot of differences in how we might rate ourselves and how others might rate us as well. So that kind of takes me towards the end of the talk here. So just we've got some conclusions here. So personality is complex and it's difficult to measure, and you might have a different idea of your personality from how your parents or your friends might rate you, but personality can be used to predict a number of life outcomes. So when I'm talking about personality here, I'm talking about these big 5 personality traits. There are other ways of measuring personality as well. Genetics and the environment kind of interact to form our unique personality types. And we might find that personality changes across the lifespan, sometimes in quite systematic ways that are similar across people. but and I've covered up some of that writing with a picture there. But some traits are more stable than others. So we might find that some traits are quite similar across the lifespan. So we kind of saw that, I think it was neuroticism or emotional stability. There wasn't, it kind of goes a little bit up and a little bit down, but people tend to be quite stable in how they rate themselves in emotional stability compared to some of the other traits there. So